Hello and welcome back to my channel. I decided to make this video today because this was a discussion that came up with two of my students this week, actually. God bless them. Both of them are perfectionist types. And the first one, when he asked me what his issue was, he basically asked me, what do you think it is that's holding me back? And I was like, can I be really honest with you? I think it's just that you're really a perfectionist and you're not allowing the language process to take place in a really natural way. So I want to talk about this topic because it is something that I've seen a lot throughout my career, and it can be a major barrier for a lot of people. Something else that I want to mention about this is something that I've noticed with a lot of my students that work in really analytical positions, or they work in tech, IT, something like that. And they'll be like, well, I want to optimize my language learning process. And I'm like, okay, well, language learning isn't really optimizable. It's not something that can be optimized, okay? And these kinds of students often ask me questions like, how many words do I have to know, or how many new vocabulary words do I have to know in order to be able to speak well? And I'm like, I want to get you away from that idea, okay? It's not that that isn't important. Certainly we need to acquire vocabulary, okay? But that's not exactly the point, right? You need to learn the language in a natural way. I read a study many years ago about different parts of the brain that are activated during different activities. They were talking about how the same part of the brain that deals with music and art and these kinds of things is the same part of the brain that deals with speech, okay? And that makes a lot of sense to me because it's a more creative part of the brain. It's not so analytical and technical, and people that work in those fields, not that those are the only people that have this problem, but often people that work in those fields, it's like there's a right way and a wrong way, very black and white thinking, and that doesn't bode well for language learning. So why doesn't perfectionism work very well with language learning? Well, there are several reasons for this. First and foremost, language in and of itself, the nature of language, is imperfect, okay? There are some people that have this ideology about language, that language has to be standardized and that we have to regulate it and it has to follow a certain order. And to a certain extent, that is true from a linguistical standpoint. It has to follow certain rules and so on so that language can be understood, and so that when you speak a language or you hear a language, you're able to communicate and understand, and there's sort of a mutual exchange. The nature of language is constantly changing, and this is how we end up with new words, slang, new phrases, new phrasal verbs, all of that kind of stuff. This is also how we end up with dead languages. Now, I'll admit, I am not a perfectionist. This is not one of my personality traits. And in some ways that has been an issue for me, especially during my academia. But on the other hand, it has helped me in my own language learning process and in other areas of my life as well. I'm not afraid to start things and continue doing things because I'm not afraid of making mistakes. In language learning, making mistakes is just part of the process, okay? It's going to happen. Learning a language is a very, very humbling experience. As adults, we're not used to having these kinds of issues, right? Like as adults, we're used to speaking and being able to communicate in our native language and having few problems. I mean, unless you have some sort of speech impediment or a delay or something like that. But the majority of us speak our native language and we feel like we can communicate decently, okay? So when you're learning a new language, this can be very humbling because you feel like there's some kind of barrier for communication, especially if you're a person that, like many of my students, are working professionals or have a really high level of education or let's say a high position at your job. That can be really humbling to be able to be in a position where maybe you don't feel like you can communicate very well. Another reason why perfectionism doesn't work in language learning is because it makes you feel like you have to control the language learning process. And again, that's just kind of counter the way that language works, okay? Language acquisition happens very naturally. And if we think about the ways that we learn language as children, I've talked about this in other videos before, but the way that we learn language as children is essentially you're born, and for the first 2 years or so of your life, you're really not saying much of anything, right? You're just listening, you're just absorbing the language around you, and you're sort of patterning intonation, vocabulary. Why does mom say this when she's giving me my bottle? Why does dad say that when he's coming home? Okay, we pattern all of these things as small children. The difference between learning a language as an adult and learning a language as a child is not necessarily that adult brains are incapable of learning. It's that children haven't learned shame yet, okay? Adults, we've learned shame. We have sort of a natural block or barrier there when it comes to being corrected or making mistakes. Children don't. When a child makes a mistake, which happens all the time, by the way, when a child makes a mistake in language, we correct it and they just don't even care. They just move on, okay? I see this a lot with my students when I go to correct them, or even if they want me to correct them. A lot of students really want this. But if I go to correct them, sometimes I can tell that it takes them aback, like, that correction kind of stings a little bit. That's just part of the process, okay? Somebody has to do it. And that's most of the reason why people are paying me. They can have conversations with people anywhere. They can have conversations with their friends or colleagues or whatever, but they pay me or any other language teacher because they need that correction. They need somebody that's going to point out those mistakes. Now, to share a bit of a personal anecdote, basically, I speak English as my native language. I learned Spanish at a pretty young age. I was about 15 when I started learning Spanish, and then I went on to study it at university and so on, okay? Then, it wasn't until I was almost 30 years old I started to learn Italian. I did not hear Italian growing up in my family despite my Italian-American background. So I learned Italian much later on in life, and my language learning experience, learning Italian was quite different from learning Spanish, mostly because my Spanish learning experience was through an academic setting, right? I was learning in school and again at university. When I learned Italian, first of all, Italian came way faster to me. There were several reasons why, one of them being that I already spoke Spanish, which is a language that's related to Italian. But additionally, it was because I was fully immersed in an Italian-speaking environment. Actually, it wasn't even an Italian-speaking environment. It was a Calabrese-speaking environment, which is the dialect of the area that I was living in. But what's interesting about this, and this sort of formed my ideology when it comes to language acquisition, even though I spoke Spanish and that certainly influenced my ability to learn Italian, being in an Italian environment, okay, and then being essentially only around Calabrian dialect, I started to learn Calabrian dialect very quickly. Now, I don't speak the Calabrian dialect. I can understand it just fine, but it surprises Calabrians sometimes when I can understand what they're saying. But the reason why is because I was fully immersed in that environment and I had no choice but to just sit and listen to what they were saying, okay? I can't emphasize this enough. That is a huge part of the language process that people try to cut out, the listening piece, okay? You need to immerse your brain in the patterning of the language somehow, whether that's in person or watching videos or listening to podcasts, whatever your method is, it doesn't really matter. Ideally, it would be in a live setting, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that you just need to listen to a lot of the language in order to pattern it and be able to make those connections in your brain. I'm sure there's some science behind this, something to do with like developing new neural pathways or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist. I have no idea. What I can tell you is just based off of my own learning experience, and then what I've observed in many years of teaching is that the people that relax into that process a little bit more generally acquire language a lot faster. Going back to what I was saying about learning Italian, I had no choice but to listen and relax, okay? And so my brain was very soft to that experience, and I acquired that language so quickly. And I was also very soft to being corrected. I wanted to be corrected, and when people corrected me, I didn't make it a big deal or take it personally. It was just like, okay, I made a mistake, and I made many mistakes. I continue to make mistakes, okay? That is just how language acquisition happens. Now, another personal anecdote, over the last couple years, I've been trying to learn Arabic, and Arabic has been kicking my ass. I'll be honest with you, because it's a totally different language family from any other language that I already speak. But just the vocabulary, the alphabet, all of it is totally different. And the reason why I'm mentioning this as a personal anecdote is because learning Arabic, I've had to just really be patient in the process. And there have been some concepts that have been presented to me through my friends or through my teacher. God bless her, she is so patient. Okay. But sometimes these concepts are presented to me and I'm just like, oh my God, I'm never gonna get that. But even though it's presented the first time and you don't get it the first time, sometimes the more you're presented with this or the more exposure you have to that concept, even if it's totally foreign, totally doesn't make sense to you at the time, it does eventually stick. It just sometimes takes a while. That is something that's really hard for perfectionists to wrap their mind around, right? Because perfectionists have a tendency to feel like they need to get something the first go around. It's not how things work, okay? I always tell my students, and I've mentioned it before in my previous videos, a little bit often. That just means having daily, frequent exposure to whatever language it is that you're learning. This could be through podcasts, reading articles, posts on social media, whatever. Of course, speaking in a natural context, taking lessons, whatever it is. But sometimes with language learning, less is more. And I think that some people, when they're learning a language, they want to be able to use it. They want to be able to speak it so quickly that they go full force. And then when they don't get it, they get frustrated. It's kind of not how language learning happens, okay? You've already got the mental blocks and we need to surpass that somehow. So I say, don't bite off more than you can chew, a little bit often, and that's going to be really, really ideal for you going forward. This is a quick video, but I hope it was helpful. I hope it was helpful for teachers in being able to explain this concept to your students a little bit if you have a student that has a lot of mental blocks and is kind of a perfectionist type. And I hope that this is helpful for language learners as well. People learning any language, not just English, but just relax with the process. Enjoy it. Actually, language learning, from my perspective, is a lot of fun, okay? It is an exercise in humility, okay? So, all that to say, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. It really helps the channel. Pass this on to your friends. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.